Time for us to get started with our Bible study this morning. As we mentioned on Wednesday, being that I'm going to be gone for a little bit, I talked to the elders and we decided not to start 2 Thessalonians today because it may sit there for a little while before we get back to it. And so instead of introducing a book, getting, maybe half a chapter in an introduction and then having to come back 2, 3, 4, however many weeks it may be to revisit it, we may forget what we had gone over already at the beginning, and then we'd have to review all of that. And so we're going to do something else this morning. What I wanted to do this morning is talk a little bit about the 17 periods of Bible history. It's been, I think, right around a year ago. I think it was the end of July last year. I had a lesson on the big picture of the Bible, and we sort of did a survey of the whole Bible. And so, we went from Genesis and we went through, and our guideline we were using in that survey was these 17 periods of Bible history. And so there were some people that asked for those, and I've got, I think it's like 30 copies printed off of the sheet of paper of the 17 periods of history. If you want those, they are on the back table where the Lord's Supper is and where the bulletin is, and so you can pick that up on that table there. It's not on the one where we normally have class handouts. I put it on the same one as where we normally put our sermon handouts, which we don't have one for this morning. So where it normally would be is the 17 periods of Bible history. But before we talk about those 17 periods, and that's what we're going to do, is we're going to talk about those 17 periods, maybe give a sort of a short summary of each of them, but really help look at them to see how it helps us in our understanding of the Bible. I want to talk first, before we get to that, about why to study this, why spend some time on this, why we're using the 17 periods that Brother Bob Waldron did. Why did Brother Waldron do this? Let me add a note to this real quick. There are some, though they're not as well known, the periods are. The preachers are about as well known, but the periods that they have of history may not be as well known. There's some that have 14. There's a book entitled The Big Picture of the Bible. I think they've got 14 periods. There's a preacher in Alabama I know who he's got 16 periods. He combines a couple of these. And so it's kind of like an outline of the text. When we talked about hermeneutics, there's no one right way to outline a text to help us look at the picture of it. But these are the ones that are a little more common. And so Brother Waldron has written a number of books through the years, surveying the Bible. Brother Waldron wrote a book entitled The Three-Cycle Approach, in which he talks about these 17 periods of history, and it's some material that he presented in classes and sermons. And so that's the periods we're going to use. That's what I learned when I was little. When I learned them was the 17 periods. I went through a class, homeschool group we were in. Brother Waldron was close by, and we actually had a class with him where he went through them with us. And so those were the ones I learned, so those are the ones we're going to use. As a side note, I have the 16 periods of Bible history written in places. My recommendation would be use the 17 for this reason. You visit somewhere else and they happen to be studying the periods of history, most likely they're going to be using the 17 because, again, those are the ones more widely distributed. Well, why study something like this? Well, it helps organize our knowledge. And I use this illustration. Imagine having a bunch of files, important documents. Maybe you've got some important tax document, or in your workplace you've got some kind of important documents, and you have all the files, and they're all sitting on the floor, and they're not organized, not alphabetically, not by category. There's just no organization to them whatsoever. And so somebody says, I need, say it's a tax document. You say, well, I need the tax document for 2021. And you've got to go over to the pile of stuff on the floor, and you've got to sort of sift through. And I know it's here because I keep everything, but I can't quite find where it's at. And so all the information you need is there. The problem is you just don't know where that exact information is. How do I find 2021's document that I need? But if you put it all in a filing cabinet and you organize it, maybe again you got your tax documents. You say, here are all my tax returns for the last 20 years. And so they're all in this order here. and they're in the order of years. And so I know 2021, I go to the back of the cabinet, I work my way forward a couple of years, and I can find it, right? And so now I know where it is. Maybe you've got some other files, and they're in alphabetical order. And so, okay, well, I need the file on, maybe you've got some files on Bible study, and you want to look at the book of, or you want to look at information you've got on the city of Jerusalem. And so I know I can sift through to J's, and then there's the information, I can find it. If it's all laying on the floor, you know you got it, but you can't find it. Well, let me suggest to you that these 17 periods of history sort of are our filing cabinet, if you will. Imagine, again, having the Bible knowledge, but not having a filing cabinet. So some of these, by the way, when I ask, you may say, well, I know exactly where to find that, because they're common stories. But just bear with me as I illustrate the point. Where can I find the story of Abraham? Or where can I find a story about David? Or what about Joash? Or when does Esther live? What time frame does Esther fall in? How do I know where to find all of those? We could just go in our knowledge and go, okay, well, hang on, let me think about this for a minute, and then work our way through. And so Esther, there in the king during that time, was Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes was in the Medo-Persian king. And so, you can sift through the information like that, or you can take this list here, and the 13th period is known as the return. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Those 6 books are all during the return. So I know if I'm reading a story about those 6, it is after Judah has returned. Now, Esther's still living back in the land with the Medes and the Persians, but it's after some of the Jews have already returned to Jerusalem. I know what time frame to put it in. And so, again, this is that filing cabinet. So that the 17 periods are, you know where a certain story falls. So to illustrate the point, I've got, looking at the 17 periods, if I said, where is a story about Abraham? Now, we should be able to go in our minds and go, oh yes, that's Genesis. Right? We'll know that off the top of our head. But let's just for a second suppose that off the top of our heads, we don't know where Abraham's story falls. Just great for a second, we don't know where these in Genesis. But I know that Abraham is a patriarch, right? So I can go through the 17 periods, and I can go, okay, creation and pre-flood, the flood, the scattering of the people. The patriarchs. That's Genesis 12 to Genesis 50. And so now I know that if Abraham's a patriarch, where does he fall? Genesis 12 to 50. Now I don't only know the book, I know the range. And then after this, part of that whole 3-cycle approach that Brother Waldron has, you actually go more detail after that. You start by learning the 17 periods. So we're going to have them with all the scriptures. My advice is, if you want to learn them, I would learn them without the scriptures first. So just learn creation and pre-flood, the flood, scattering of the people, patriarchs, Exodus, wandering in the wilderness, and go down the line of the 17. Then, after you're confident in that, go back, and that's when you add in the scriptures. Now, not only do I know that the first period is creation and pre-flood, I know it's Genesis 1 to 5. And so I know, where's Cain and Abel take place? Well, it's somewhere between Genesis 1 and 5 because it was pre-flood. And so I can narrow it down. Genesis isn't the best example of that because we know where most of those fall. But it helps in stories later on. Where do I find a story about David? Well, I know it's in Kings or Chronicles, but is it 1 Kings or 2 Kings? Is it 1 Chronicles or 2 Chronicles? Well, when I go to the period of the United Kingdom, and it's 1 Samuel 10 to 1 Kings 11, and 1 Chronicles 2 to 2 Chronicles 9, I know if it's a story of Saul or David or Solomon, it's now in that range, not just the whole of the books. So you see, we're sort of narrowing down where to find the information. You know where to look. Maybe not the specific chapter yet, but it's a lot easier when I know, okay, I want a story of David, and I know it's somewhere from 1 Samuel 10 to 1 Kings 11. And it's somewhere from 1 Chronicles to 2 Chronicles 9. That's a lot better than having to look from 1 Samuel 10 to 2 Kings 7 or 2 Kings 25, and from 1 Chronicles 1 through 2 Chronicles 36. That's a lot of chapters to cover. And so, we're sort of narrowing it down. So where this helps us is it takes all that information we already know, but it puts it in an organization. Again, and compare it to an outline. It's not quite like a normal outline. For example, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Job, the major prophets, for the most part. Ezekiel and Daniel we include, but Jeremiah and Isaiah, we don't have all those put in the periods because some of them overlap periods. But in terms of the history books, the books of history, and then the two prophets that cover the captivity, and then that are in captivity, Ezekiel and Daniel, and then the ones after the return, we have grouped together. Everybody else takes place somewhere earlier, and that's different information to learn. But for the most part, we narrow it down in that. Working through the 17 periods of history now. So we've got, again, the 17 of them. I've got, again, the verses with them. If you're saying, okay, I want to learn all this, what do I do first? I would start by only looking at this part right here and ignore that latter half for the start. You're going to need that if you want to know exactly where to find the information. But it makes it easier. It's not a problem to remember Genesis 1 to 5, but let me just skip over here. These are a lot more difficult because you've got multiple books dealt with in the United Kingdom, divided Kingdom, and Judah alone. You've got to remember Kings and Chronicles. And so some of those it's a little more difficult. So learn the periods first, add the verses second. The third side of that, and we're not talking about the third side of that this morning, is then we narrow it down even more. So for example, the patriarchs, Genesis 12 to 50, but I want to find the story of Abraham. I've narrowed it down to Genesis 12 to 50. How do I narrow it down further? That's where, you remember when we outline, we have our main point, and then we have our subpoints. That's where you would sort of add in your subpoints. So I know that Abraham lived from chapter 12 to chapter 27, but Isaac actually became the main focus in chapter 24 when they went to find him a wife. So if it's a story of Abraham, most likely it's 12 to 23. If it's a story of Isaac, it's 23, 24, 25, and I think 26. I think 27 is where it shifts to Jacob. And we follow Jacob until in the 30s where we start to follow Joseph, who's not actually one of the patriarchs, but he's in that time frame, and so it's easier to remember him this way. Let me add this disclaimer. If you happen to have learned these before with Brother Waldron's material, if you happen to have Brother Waldron's material, the scriptures that I'm going to give are slightly different. It's his periods of Bible history that he did, but these are different. For example, I believe it's something like down here in Invasion and Conquest, or the wondering he has going through like Joshua 4, and then the Invasion and Conquest is 5 through 24. I've got to try to round them off as much as possible just to make it a little bit easier, because those first couple of chapters of Joshua are really just preparation to enter in. They technically are still wandering in the wilderness, but it's preparation to enter the promised land. So let's go through the periods of Bible history now. Genesis 1 to 5 is creation and pre-flood. So again, as you work through, you want to know where the story of creation takes place. Where's man created? You can narrow that down, which again, we should know that one off the top of our heads pretty easily, but Genesis 1 to 5. Where does Cain and Abel take place? Well, I know it's somewhere in Genesis 1 to 5. Where do I read of the genealogy from Adam to Noah? I go to Genesis. In this case, it's actually chapter 5. That's the transition where the genealogy is given. Well, if this is creation and pre-flood, you can probably figure out what the next one's going to be, right? If this is creation and pre-flood, the second period is probably, well, the flood. And then in Genesis 6 to 10, and then, to me, I always thought, and Brother Walter's been asked this question, why isn't it post-flood? Because that kind of was my thought, was why didn't he name it flood and post-flood? Have 3 periods of history, or have it here. And why is 6 and 10 just the flood? Brother Waldron's answer to that was, I guess if I wanted to call it post-flood, I could only have 2 periods of history. Because in reality, everything was before the flood or after the flood. So he named it the flood. Brother Leon Malden, who has the 16, I believe, does name it flood and post-flood events in 6 through 11. This, by the way, is where Brother Leon Malden and Brother Waldron's differ. Brother Waldron has the scattering of the people as a separate period of history. Brother Leon Malden has it as one period, the flood, and then the immediate post-flood events. I've heard the arguments from both of them as to why they have it, and they both make a good case. Brother Waldron argues Genesis 11 is a significant event in biblical history. What happens in the scattering of the people? That's the building of the Tower of Babel. And so that's how we have all these different nations that split off. Brother Malden would argue that this is a significant event. It is not significant enough to warrant its own period of history. And so he groups them together. In reality, by the way, it's not Genesis 11. The latter half of Genesis 11 is actually a genealogy. In reality, the event of the Tower of Babel is only something like 16 verses at the most, I think. Something like that. So I've heard both arguments. I think both make a good case as for its significance. But if you were asking my opinion, I would combine these two. But this is the way that I learned it, and so, and this is the way that most people learn it that do learn it, because Brother Waldron's material is very widespread. And so, for simplicity's sake, just remember the 17. It's one more period of history. We're not talking like the 13 to 17 jump. We're talking one more period of the scattering of the people, Genesis 11. Genesis 12 to 50, the patriarchs. So again, I want to know where to find Abraham, or I want to know where to find a story about Isaac, or I want to know where to find a story about Jacob. I've now narrowed it down from it's somewhere in Genesis to it's somewhere from 12 to 50. And so I've narrowed it down a little bit. The Exodus, it spans from Exodus to Numbers 13. This period is named after, obviously, the first book in it, the Exodus. This is them leaving. This is the law being given and all of that. So we have the Exodus, or the exit from Egypt, and they come and they get the law. They spy out the land in chapter 13. And so this is all them exiting Egypt. Well, why is it all exiting Egypt? Because in chapter 14, now we begin what? The wandering. By the way, when you get to the point, if you try to memorize these and you get to the point that you want to add in the chapters, here's the easier way to remember it. Remember that these sections, particularly in the Old Testament, end with some kind of significant event. So let's just back up here. Creation and pre-flood. This ends with, or begins with, some significant event. This ends with a genealogy linking us to Noah. Chapter 6 then is the promise of the flood. So that's the start of the flood. It goes through chapter 10 because chapter 11 is the significant event, which is what? Scattering of the people. The patriarchs, Genesis 12 to 50. It ends in Genesis 50 with a significant event, the death of Joseph. So the period ends. The Exodus spans from Exodus to Numbers 13. Numbers 13, the people spy out the land. They come back and give a bad report. So because of their bad report, the people listen to that. Now God says you're going to be punished and you're going to have to what? Wander in the wilderness. So we have the sixth one. When that comes to an end, after Moses' death in the end of 40 years, Joshua takes over as leader. He leads the people in the invasion of and conquest of the land of Canaan. That's the book of Joshua. Then after the days of Joshua and all the elders that outlived Joshua, the people, according to Judges chapter 1, did what was right in their own eyes. So because of that, God had to raise up judges. And so those judges span from Judges, or the book of Judges, the book of Ruth, and the book of 1 Samuel. Now, if you want to find a story about a judge, you're not going to find it in Ruth, but the book of Ruth takes place during that time frame of the judges. It's when the judges are over Israel that the book of Ruth takes place. And that goes to 1 Samuel 9. Because, remember this, when book of 1 Samuel opens up, we have a judge by the name of Eli. And then, after Eli's death, we have a judge by the name of, the book bears his name, Samuel. And then it's during the life of Samuel, they say, give us a king. So then we have a period where there's a king or a kingdom, not just a nation, they're now a kingdom. But now, it's not just that there's a kingdom, because we could just say the kingdom. But that doesn't make any sense, because remember, there's an event where the kingdom divides. So when Saul and David and Solomon are king, the kingdom is united. And so we've got the united kingdom. That starts in 1 Samuel 10. Saul is, they asked for a king, I think it's chapter 8. He's anointed chapter 9. I think chapter 10 is when he officially becomes king. He may be anointed in 10, but it's somewhere around that time frame. That goes through 1 Kings 11. Just as a side note, again, as you sort of subdivide down, 1 Samuel 10 through the end of the book is the reign of Saul. 2 Samuel is the reign of David. And 1 Kings 1 to 11, well, really it's 3 to 11. 1 and 2 is sort of David's preparation to hand over the kingdom. But for simplicity's sake, if you want to remember this, then the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings is the reign of Solomon. Because again, 1 and 2 is sort of the preparation, David preparing Solomon to take over. I remember that's where he makes the statement, I go the way of all the earth. It's his preparation. In 1 Chronicles, the books of Chronicles only really follow the line of David. You would say, what's the difference in Kings and Chronicles? Kings deals with everybody. It just deals with the kings. The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles are chronicles, if you will, of the line of David. It does mention kings of Israel, but it only mentions kings of Israel if they interact with kings of Judah. So, 1 Chronicles through 2 Chronicles 9 is the United Kingdom. But 1 Chronicles doesn't really deal with Saul. 1 Chronicles 1 to 9 is a genealogies. I remember from our Bible reading this year, it was a lot of names for 9 chapters of genealogies there in 1 Chronicles. And so that's just getting us through the line, and here's the people in the priestly line and the line of David and all of this. Then in chapter 10 is the death of Saul. And the rest of 1 Chronicles is the reign of David. And then 2 Chronicles 1 to 9 is the reign of Solomon. Well then, remember Solomon went after many foreign women, and they pulled his heart away from God, and God said that he wasn't going to do it in Solomon's days, but in the days of his son, the kingdom would be divided. So, that gives, if the kingdom was united, now it's divided, we go to the divided kingdom. 1 Kings 12 to 2 Kings 17, 2 Chronicles 10 to 29. The reason it's that is in chapter 29 of 2 Chronicles and in 2 Kings 17, we have the fall of Samaria, which is the capital of Israel. Samaria falls, Israel is taken away into Assyrian captivity. So the kingdom was, here again, as we're building on it, we sort of help fill in the blanks by building period to period. We had the judges. They asked for a king. The whole kingdom was united, so we have the united kingdom. Then in the days of Rehoboam, it became divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern of Judah. Then the northern kingdom was taken away. That means we have Judah alone, 2 Kings 18 to 25, 2 Chronicles 30 to 36. And again, 25 and 30 of 2 Kings and 36 of 2 Chronicles, that's when they are taken away. Well, Judah was left alone, but now Judah is in captivity. What covers the captivity? The books of Ezekiel and Daniel. So you want to know stories about the captivity and what things were like? You can look in these 2 books, who, by the way, are in 2 very different situations. Daniel, it seems, was a noble or from the noble or royal line. What makes us say that? Well, Daniel was taken in the first captivity. We get all our time frame, and he was taken into the service of the king. So Daniel was of some noble status back in Judah. So those when the first captives were taken. That was what they did with the first captivity. They took some more a little bit later, and then the third and final captivity was the destruction of Jerusalem. So Daniel was taken in the first captivity. He is in Babylon. We often call it Babylon, but in reality, or the Babylonians, but in reality, they are the Chaldeans. And the Babylonian term comes from their capital city of Babylon. That's where those of more noble birth and higher status that were taken in the first captivity were taken. That's where Daniel's at. That's why he's in the service of the king. Ezekiel, though, is taken captive, and he's with the common captives by the river. Anybody know? Kibar is where Ezekiel's at with the common captives. Well, after they're in captivity, they get to go back. Some of them get to go back, or they get to return, which is Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, I think this is where sometimes we have to remember, as you're flipping through your Bible, everything is not in chronological order, right? Have you ever done a reading plan that was a chronological reading plan? And so what you do is you go to Genesis and you read through parts of Genesis, and then all of a sudden you jump over to Job, and then you come back to Genesis and you finish that out. And then somewhere in the line you go to the next book, but now we got to mix in some of the Psalms because Moses wrote one of the Psalms. But then we go back to reading from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then we go to Joshua, and then we go to 1 Samuel. Oh, but now we got to jump ahead and read Ruth. Now we got to come back. We're reading Kings and Chronicles simultaneously. And then when we get there, it's like Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther don't exist because we skip them to go to the prophets. We read the prophets, and we get through those, and now we read Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi together. Why? They're all returned. So again, you remember it this way. There were 3 returns from captivity. The first was led by a man who does not have a book that bears his name, but it was by a man by the name of Zerubbabel, who led the first return. That is recorded in the first 6 chapters, I think it is, of Ezra, is the first return. That purpose was for the rebuilding of the temple. The second return was by a man by the name of Ezra, the writer of the book of Ezra, and probably, and we're not going to get into this morning, but I think probably the writer of 1st and 2nd Chronicles as well. There's some evidence that suggests that as well. And so he leads the second return. The third return, and that return is for the spiritual restoration of the people. He is a priest, and he's coming to help bring the people back. They've got a temple now, but they need to come back to serving God. The third and final return is led by a man by the name of Nehemiah. And that is for the rebuilding of the walls or the city itself. So, I want to know, where do they come back and build the temple? Well, I can go to Ezra. I know because that's here in the return. Haggai and Zechariah, by the way, also deal with the temple. There was a period of time frame where in Ezra, during the days of Zerubbabel, there was enemies that opposed them and got them to stop building the temple. And had sent word to the king. And the prophets, by the name of Haggai and Zechariah, had to come and tell the people, you need to finish building the temple. And then that latter half of the first section, those chapters like, I think it's 4, 5, and 6, somewhere in there, in Ezra, they finally finished the temple. Malachi takes place. It is the final book, not just in terms of when you go through it. It's Malachi, a blank page in Matthew. Malachi is the final book in terms of final book in terms of what was written. That was the last of the Old Testament written before we actually have 400 years of silence. What scripture goes with that? Nothing, because there was 400 years of silence. I think I mentioned this when we talked about when we did that survey of the Bible. The 14th period of history is the blank page between Malachi and Matthew. That page where it says New Testament, and you flip it over and it's blank on the other side, that's 400 years take place on the turning of that page. And then we come to the life of Christ. That's the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, again, these are ones that we would know. We want to know a story about the life of Christ. Where did we go? We know we need to go to the Gospels. But again, the New Testament we're more familiar with, right? That's what we're under, the law we're under. We're more familiar with the New Testament. I think where this really is helpful is the first 13 and the Old Testament, because it helps us with the Old Testament stories we may not be as familiar with. After the life of Christ, we have the early church in Acts. Its establishment, its spread, and really that early church is actually dealing with about 30 years of history. We're going from around 33 AD when Christ was resurrected and ascended into heaven in Acts 1 until somewhere around 61, 62 when Paul is in prison in Rome. And so the early church. And then the final one we often call the epistles, but for this we call it the letters to Christians. And the reason is you'll sometimes see Romans through Judah's epistles and Revelation as a book of prophecy. But all of those, Romans through Revelation, whether it was a regular epistle or it was a book of prophecy, all of them was a letter written to Christians. And so, again, Romans to Revelation. And again, as I said, particularly these last three, we may not be as familiar with the years of silence. This section we're going to be very familiar with. And so we know we go find something in the epistles. But why I think this is most beneficial is those 13 Old Testament ones. When I want to find an Old Testament story, I remember a story about, the temple and something about them not building the temple after they returned. And where does that take place? Well, I know that it's got to be Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, or Malachi. That's a lot better than having to search from all of those books of the Old Testament. So hopefully this is beneficial to you. I find it being very beneficial to know the 17 periods of history. And again, if you want to learn them, my suggestion would be learn them without the verses, then add in the verses. And if you want, you can actually find Brother Baldwin's book on the 3-cycle approach to help you through it. And all the periods are printed out on the back